Hello A2, welcome to Gender Bias. We look at, which is the first topic within Issues and Debates. We look at two issues, gender and cultural bias, and then all the rest, as you can see there, are debates. Is it free will, is it determinism, is it nature, is it nurture, and so on. They're just two of the types of questions that you might see. There are shorter 4 markers, and then there could be a big 16 marker answer as well. You'll find those on Andy's paper 3 alongside the topics that he looks at with you. So, gender bias. Psychology should be, or all theories in psychology should have universality or be universal. That means they can be applied to all people but still allow for individual differences. So they can cover and explain everybody, and but flexible enough to allow for difference. So if we're looking specifically at gender, we would think of as theories as a theory being able to apply, any theory that exists being able to apply to all gender identities, including not identifying as any particular gender, but it should also be flexible enough to allow for the fact that all those people, all those different gender identities are different and potentially would behave in different ways. So it should be able to explain everybody but allow for difference, and as we know from psychology, that is not the case. Generally, psychology is of the sciences is one that is better for gender bias. So psychology, because of the new nature of it, so the fact that it's only been around just over 100 years, should protects it from sort of ingrained gender issues that older, much more well-established sciences might have, or medicine, for example, and which are all being challenged now. That's because very quickly, from from the study of psychology, the history of psychology, women were allowed very quickly to be able to start to access an education, and psychology was one of those degrees that it wasn't ingrained in them, only men studied it. It was able to adapt and change quite quickly, which potentially could explain why psychology does generally draw in more women than men for study, especially at the level you're at A level. However, that effect starts to dilute the higher you go up to PhD level. There are two types of bias. There is alpha bias and beta bias. Alpha bias is the overemphasis of gender differences and the bit about alpha bias, it says that the two genders are different and that one gender is better than the other gender ultimately. So you might have heard the term alpha male, or sort of describing the main kind of what we call the top dog in a pack of animals, I don't know, wolves or something. You would have an alpha male who would be the top dog, and it's the same within gender. If we go just with the two dichotomous gender, there's male or female, which again is already an issue with this. But if we went with that view, then it would be generally, most of the time, it is male behaviours and the male gender which is viewed as the alpha gender, and then female feminine behaviours are kind of seen as inferior to that. And there are two examples here. There's Freud with castration anxiety. So you will look at Freud in more detail in approaches after Issues and Debates. But Freud believes that part of the development of the superego, which is the part of the personality which holds morals, is that men have to experience castration anxiety. That means, for various different reasons, that you worry that your father will castrate you. And if you might want to Google that term to see what it is. We won't go into any great detail here, but it involves removing a certain body part. So you'd be worried that would happen. Experiencing that castration anxiety means that you identify with your father rather than so when you're anxious, when you experience castration anxiety, rather than be scared and run away, the way that you know that you should develop a relationship with them, work with them, identify with them, and then that will mean that they won't want to castrate you. And that identification develops the superego, so where you learn the morals, you identify with the morals of the father. And that was Freud's explanation as to why criminal behaviours ran in families, because you'd identified with the father had a criminal moral view, and then in families where there wasn't criminality, you've identified with the father whose morals does not allow you to commit crime, and you've identified with those. The problem with that theory is that women cannot experience castration anxiety. they can't be worried about having they can't be worried about having their penis removed specifically, which is what castration anxiety is around. So therefore, Freud suggested they weren't able to identify with the same-sex parent, weren't able to develop the superego, and therefore had a weaker, were morally more inferior to men. So women don't have the same understanding and depth of understanding and same moral compass that men have, because they can't experience castration anxiety and therefore can't develop a superego as effectively. So as you can see there already, you've got men as the morally superior and women as morally inferior. It's also the sociobiological theory. So this is the idea that one second, let me just check my notes. So sociobiological theory fits very, very closely with the evolutionary approach. So it's the idea that men seek out short-term relationships because they are able to impregnate as many women as possible and pass on their genetics, whereas women seek out long-term relationships. So they can be protected when they're impregnated. They can be protected. They can be cared. They want a mate that remains with them and cares for them, provides them with food and protection. So the way that this fits with alpha bias is the idea that sexual promiscuity in males is part of their evolution. They've evolved to do it, and it's a perfectly acceptable behaviour, and they are considered there's overemphasising the difference there between the genders, whereas women should seek out only long-term relationships. So because of that, any women who engage in male behaviour, so who are sexually promiscuous themselves, would be that behaviour would be frowned upon, because genetically it's not explainable, whereas it's forgiven in men because it is genetically explainable and justifiable. And again, alpha bias men are kind of held up as the example, as the normal behaviour, and women are seen as the inferior choice or the inferior process. And that comes with the argument around is that you would hear lots and lots of people referring to women as sluts if they sleep around. However, you wouldn't generally, although I like to think that's changing now a little bit, although it'd be nice not to call anyone a slut, but if you had to, that term could also apply, people also would apply to men as well. So traditionally it has only been something that's been applied to men, a judgment about their promiscuity in a way that to women, in a way that it hasn't been applied to men. Beta bias is the opposite, so that minimises the gender differences. For example, here with beta bias, they studied only male participants. It was male animals that studied the fight. You studied the fight or flight response with, because female animals, lab animals, generally aren't used because their hormone cycle varies so much. So for the purposes of control, they use male animals. However, that does give skewed results. So they found that flight or fight existed, and you know all about fight or flight response and how the process works. So they thought, oh well, we found that in men, so we can just blanketly apply that to women as well, and completely ignore there's differences between men and women. So more recent research suggests that male animals, male humans, experience the fight or flight response, but actually women or female animals generally tend to experience the tend or befriend response, which is a slightly different response. Fight or flight, you're going to fight or run away. Tend or befriend is care for or make friends with something. So beta bias ignores that. It looks at only men and then applies that behaviour to men and women, ignoring that there's differences between the two, therefore ignoring the fact that actually women might be more tend to befriend. Kohlberger also did this, so he only studied male participants, male boys, and he created the stages of moral development based on their responses to a stimulus. So a scenario, they were asked a scenario about Heinz had a sick wife, and he can't access the drugs, what should he do? And there was lots of different ways that he could deal with it, and Kohlberg asked that question, and from that developed the theory of moral development. At this stage, young boys would have this kind of moral development. At this age you'd have this kind of moral development, a bit like Piaget's stages for cognitive development, but this is moral development. And he took that, having only looked at men, and applied it to both men and women, and consistently it was found, using Kohlberg's moral theory of development, theory of moral development, that women consistently weren't, no matter what age they were, they always lagged behind the boys. So if they were supposed to have achieved a stage by 6, they hadn't, they were still behind, and they never fully kind of reached the highest levels of moral development. However, Gilligan suggested, so she went and looked at that, and she suggested that actually it wasn't because women again were morally inferior, it's because Kohlberg had taken only from a male sample, and generally it was found that men have more of a justice sense of morality, so they're all about fairness and what's right and wrong, in a justice sense, whereas Gilligan found that actually women were much more focused on the ethics of care, so is care being prioritised, and she redeveloped the stages so that they didn't, so then women, and when we used it and tested it in that way, women were found to progress through the stages at the right age, as you would expect. So it wasn't appropriate. Kohlberg ignored that there were gender differences and applied it to everybody, and it wasn't appropriate to. We needed, at that point for moral development, we needed different ways of explaining development for men and for women. Androcentrism is a focus on males. So we talked about alpha bias, and generally we've referred to the fact that it's mostly mostly males that are kind of held up as the normal behaviour, as the alpha, the main gender. And androcentrism is the word to describe that, where it focuses purely on men. But it's a consequence of beta bias. So generally it's a consequence of minimising and ignoring gender differences. Because we're saying, well, the male behaviour is the correct way, i.e. moral justice, moral development through justice is the correct way, whereas actually, so then it makes women look like they're morally inferior, where in fact it's just women just approach the situation differently or consider it differently. Androcentrism, there's several arguments why it is focused mainly on men. We have the fact that most of the psychologists within psychology are generally white males, and this is a list of the top 10 psychologists as voted by a group of people. You don't need to remember this off by heart, but it's just to illustrate the point. Every single one of those, and most of them you studied or will study, every single one of those is male. So that very much skews psychology's understanding and ability to explain theories, because it's got mostly a male perspective, and therefore the theories developed from male psychologists will mostly support and maintain male dominated views, and possibly not consider women, again referring back to Kohlberg, if you think that's one example of the focus being on men, when actually we need a Gilligan to kind of consider, well, actually it's the ethics of care as well. Another example is samples. So androcentrism, an example of this would be in the samples that we choose. If you think about the really famous research, Milgram, Zimbardo, Ash, they were all male samples, and again that's an example of beta bias, because we've taken the sample, it's all male, and then we've taken our findings and we've applied them blanketly to everybody, when really all we should be able to do, because of the population validity, is apply them to explaining men's behaviours. And they did find that, and there's a link there that talks about it, when they did conduct the research when we looked at Milgram's research, that women did have a different response to it. And it was also, he had, and it does quote the figure there, I can't remember exactly what it is, but Milgram had 780 participants, and only 40 of them, or something like that, a very, very small number of them were female. So of course the results can't be applied blanketly. There is also some research into PMS, so Premenstrual Syndrome, and the fact that that is used to medicalise and female anger. So generally the view would be that it would be acceptable for men to be angry. It's kind of considered a reasoned kind of thing. If a man gets frustrated in a meeting, they can get angry, and that's because of the situation, so it's an appropriate response. So it's not the man's fault, it's he's responding appropriately to the situation. If a woman got cross, for example, in a meeting, the argument is that we've kind of medicalised this idea of PMS and the fact that actually it's women's hormones that make them angry. So it'd be like, oh, you cross, are you on your period? So it's a problem with the woman, not necessarily an appropriate response to what's a very frustrating situation as well. There are lots and lots of different examples, and what I would say is that you want to pick the ones that you feel could explain it best. If it was a 16 marker, you'd want to talk about all three of those terms and universality, so 4. So we don't really have an example for universality though, and so I'd say maybe pick one example for each one of those that you feel that you could explain, and that you could then explain the example itself, and also explain why it demonstrates alpha, beta, or androcentrism bias or androcentrism. Okay, so you don't need to know all of them. If you can think of another example that's more effective, you can use that one. You're welcome to read the psychology books. I'm happy for you to do that. Okay, evaluation, just to brace yourself, will be changing slightly, and this is the hardest one to apply it to, so it certainly won't be perfect. However, for gender and cultural bias, so for the issues, we're going to look at NRR, which is negative impact, research and reducing, and then in debates we're going to look at NRI, negative impact, research and interaction, in the interactionalist approach, to the fact that it's not nature or nurture, generally they work together, and that draws a nice conclusion as well. Okay, so think for the moment negative impact, research, reducing. Another thing to consider with the evaluation points and the way that you approach them is the fact that we're not going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses, so we're not going to say a good thing about gender biases or a bad thing about gender biases. What you're going to discuss instead is kind of we're going to acknowledge that gender bias is a bad thing, and we're either going to discuss why it's a bad thing or how we can or the fact that acknowledging gender bias then allows us to work on ways of reducing it. And because it's a new way of structuring, you can still use the P structure, but I just recommend you think carefully about how you use your point sentences, and we'll talk through that in the video as it goes. Because it's new, I wouldn't worry too much if you don't get it the first time. Hopefully by the time that we've written all of the issues and debates, you'll be really comfortable with the ideas. So the first thing is a weakness. A weakness of, or an impact of, gender bias is that a problem with gender bias is that it does have a very negative impact. So for example, it reinforces very negative stereotypes, such as women's moral inferiority. I like to think that concept doesn't exist so much anymore, but just things like, oh, don't worry your little head about it. Or if you think about the Victorian period, women really were viewed quite strongly as morally inferior. There was a big panic when they were given the right to vote, because women, how could they possibly understand morals and politics? They will vote in the most ridiculous ways. So, and Freud was around that time, so he was reinforcing those negative stereotypes with flawed psychological research, or research that couldn't quite be justified. So that's a significant problem. Also, another problem is that it treats deviations, or another negative impact is treating deviations from traditional sex roles as pathological. So that means that pathological means that we consider it unhealthy in some way. And again, this could link, whilst we could look at more modern times, and it probably still does exist, if we look back not so long ago, that women who wanted careers were considered unhealthy or unwell people. It was pathological, it was unusual, it was abnormal, whereas now we just know that men and women both have equal right to be ambitious within their careers, even though potentially it's still viewed as, so even today you can see the ramifications of that, because sometimes some people say quite unfair things about working mothers and make quite a few judgments about them. So there is still remnants of those the problems that were developed by Freud and other psychologists who experienced gender bias. So the example we've got here is that Freud said, well, if women were ambitious, if they had career ambitions, then that's because of penis envy. So really all that they want is a penis, and they're very jealous of our penises. Freud's an interesting character, and we will look at him in psychodynamic approach. You can make your own personal judgments on his interesting theory. Okay. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. So that is one of the problems, one of the weaknesses of gender bias being endemic throughout the whole of psychology, is that it reinforces stereotypes, and it treats deviations from traditional sex roles as pathological, as an illness, as being unwell. And of course that causes, if the research nowadays, if people read and look at that research, it potentially makes people query and question the validity of psychology itself. It can make people quite uncomfortable, and it can also encourage institutional sexism, so kind of mass sexism too. So it could put people off psychology as a subject, which would mean that we'd get less funding, we wouldn't have as good ambitious people in psychology, which might reduce the quality of the work that we do, and therefore the validity. So it is a little bit trickier to explain an evaluation point, but do give it a go. Research. So research, sometimes when we talk about research initiative debates, it can be research that can illustrate the nature side of the debate or the nurture side of the debate, for example. However, here, or the other thing we can talk about is how being very much on one side of the debate or the other, or experiencing an issue or not, so in this case a gender bias being an issue, is how that impacts on the research, and in this case it impacts it very negatively. So of course, if we're relying quite strongly on or if we don't acknowledge that gender bias exists, and therefore the importance of ensuring things like a mixed and representative sample, then it's going to reduce the validity of the research, and therefore any theories that we develop in psychology, calling into question the validity of psychology as a whole. And the perfect examples there are moral development and fight or flight, but you could talk about Ash, Milgram, there's loads of different ones. So if we don't acknowledge that gender bias exists and that we have to challenge it and tackle it in some way, then all of our theories are going to lack validity, regardless of whether we have an androcentric sample, i.e. male only, or if we have a female-centred sample as well. That's we don't want to go one way or the other. We want to make sure the sample is representative to all. And then a point that you can continue from that with a however potentially would be acknowledging gender bias ensures that we promote effective research. If we say there is a problem with androcentrism and only using all male or all female samples, then acknowledging that promotes more valid and more reliable research. So ensuring that the sample is representative. And also there's a lot of research suggests that women don't benefit as well from being studied in lab conditions, and that's not because they're better or worse, it's just because lab conditions is less complementary or allows us to study them more effectively, so causes problems with the validity. So Eagley and Johnson suggest that we should have a mixed approach to conducting the research. So we should have both the artificial, but also we're going to balance that with the kind of more naturalistic research, and also the same with qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative research favours men, whereas quantitative research, maths, numbers, figures, favours men, whereas qualitative research generally favours females more. So really we need to ensure that we're providing a mix of both, and the majority of research now should, if it's good research, should offer us both qualitative and quantitative research. There are lots of different ways we're looking at reducing it. So feminist psychology, a strength of acknowledging that gender bias exists is that feminist psychology was developed in response to this. So they acknowledge that whilst there are a small number of biological differences, the majority of the research that we see, the majority of the differences we see between men and women are social constructs. So the reason that men and women are different is that we see differences is because of the way society is constructed to see those differences between men and women, and any other agendas that people identify as. So a piece of research that demonstrates that it's a social construct is they generally found that women were who were surrounded by people who didn't hold the belief that women weren't good at maths were better at maths, and women who were surrounded by people who held that stereotypical belief that women couldn't do maths were not as good at maths, suggesting it's not maths ability is not biologically driven, but it's socially driven. It depends who we surround ourselves with. And there is a piece of research in the I can't remember if it's the cat dog, the dog book, or the green-haired girl book now, around leadership, and it identifies the fact that generally feminist psychology says not only should we identify the differences between gender, but really the only time we should be identifying differences is if we can offer support. So Eagley, and this was in 1978, so I'd be fascinated to know if this finding still applies today, found that women weren't effective leaders, and Eagley suggested that we should embrace that knowledge, that finding, and then we should put in place to make women more effective leaders. So we shouldn't just say men are better leaders, that's it, done. We should put that support in place, and that would apply also if we found that men were detrimental and had a deficit in some way. For example, aren't prepared. The perfect example would be saying they're not prepared to go to the doctor, so that's why there is a higher rate of potentially part of the reason why there's a higher rate for male suicide. Also, all men kind of have conditions for longer that are undiagnosed because they don't go to the doctors, they don't talk about their mental or physical health, and so we've put support in place to encourage that to happen. As you can see at the moment, there's a huge range of things that people are promoting around encouraging men to talk about their mental health. So we've not just gone, oh well, men are worse at talking about their mental health, done. We've gone, we've found that, what support can we put in place? And feminist psychology is all about not just identifying those differences if we have to identify them, but how can we rectify them. Therefore, increasing the validity of the findings they allow, we take the research and apply it more to real life, and it's more accurate, more valid. If we're constantly saying, oh, it's biological, and it's not, it's social, that's not a very valid finding to have, both for males or for females. Another thing that you could use, and again, just like I said on the other slide, you don't have to use all of these, it's whichever ones you feel comfortable with. Something else that was developed to reduce gender bias was reflexivity. Reflection is reflecting on how something went, oh, so that went well, or that didn't go so well. Reflexivity is acknowledging and kind of responding to your own bias. So, for example, a teacher might reflect, if they're reflecting on behaviour management in a class, they might think, oh, that class went terribly, that was so awful, I did really badly. That would be reflection. Reflexivity would be going, that I think that class went really badly, however I have exceptionally high behaviour management standards. They might acknowledge that they came from a military background where the discipline was stronger, so that might be why I think my behaviour management wasn't so good. Another teacher might go, that behaviour management was brilliant, reflect on it, I was dead happy with the way that the class worked. But then what they need, then that would be reflection. Reflexivity would be acknowledging a bias that exists. So for example, they know that they thought, well actually they all behave really well, but we just had a bit of a chat, and we were kind of like, we were talking like friends, so I was quite pleased with the way that behaved, but actually I was that quite, because of my bias, the fact I want them all to like me, was that actually the right kind of behaviour that they should display? And it should be exactly the same thing in psychology. So we should acknowledge and respond to bias. So men should acknowledge that there's certain biases that they will have, having a male experience, and females should acknowledge there are certain biases that they will have, having a female experience. And again, we're being very dichotomous, men and women, and of course there's a huge range of genders. So basically, whatever someone identifies as their gender as, they should acknowledge that that causes some kind of bias, and that we should respond to it, and that will allow us, embracing that bias will allow us to identify it and kind of discuss it within our research. We can't remove it, but we can, if we acknowledge it, at least we can kind of pick it apart a little bit, again increasing the validity of the research that we do. And then it also encourages to re-examine assumptions. So Darwin believed, exactly as we've discussed before, men short-term relationships, they can impregnate as many women as possible. Women long-term relationships, so when they're pregnant they can be protected and cared for. However, knowing that gender bias exists, that has encouraged us to go back and re-examine some of those assumptions. For example, such as Darwin. So actually now there's a lot of research suggests that women want short-term mates too, and there is some benefit to that. And we've gone back and examined that because somebody's gone, hang on a minute, that sounds very much like it was influenced by gender bias. So the time that Darwin was around, there'd have been lots of things around women. Not being allowed to have any kind of not being sexual in any way, so there couldn't be any sexual promiscuity. They should wait to marriage and then only for childbearing purposes, whereas men at Darwin's time were kind of encouraged, and it was seen as a rite of passage to sleep with lots of women who weren't their wives, to have affairs with people who weren't their wives. Stereotypically, there was that very much that. So was Darwin being influenced by his environment, by the gender bias that existed in the culture, and therefore was kind of skewed in that way. We've gone back and examined that, and we have found a really interesting piece of research that women also look for short-term mates, because of course if men are having all these one-night stands, short-term relationships, and women are only having long-term relationships, who are all these men having one-night stands with, and who are all these women having long-term relationships with? So it falls down, and again that allows us to ensure that if you think about it, we potentially encourage us to have paradigm shifts. It allows us to look at falsifiability. If we look at theory construction, we need to consistently be evaluating and redeveloping theory so it fits with the features of science really nicely. Okay. I hope you've enjoyed your first foray into gender bias. It isn't always quite this political, although cultural bias is the next one. So we do explore kind of looking at different cultures and alpha and beta bias within in culture, within race as well, and how we view things. So not only are the top psychologists all men, but generally they're all white as well, which again introduces some bias. But we'll look at that next week. This is a list of potential things that I would recommend that you want to do. If you're thinking, I want to revise, I have no idea idea how to do it. There's 100 different things that you could look at, so pick one of those at random and have a go at it. Your exams are creeping steadily closer and you want to be prepared for them. Okay, any questions, because it is a new topic, please get in touch with me and we'll go through them. Otherwise, I have the pleasure of reading them in lesson. Thank you very much.